right. Let's start with the softball. Who uses the Servlet API? Come on, show of hands. Okay. Yeah, so a couple guys teased me. I think Uncle teased me a little bit on the session management one. It's sort of like saying, rethinking servlet sessions is like saying, your cat's ugly or something like that. Could be a controversial topic. But. So I'm going to be doing a mini talk. So this is going to be about 30 to 40 minutes long, and then David's going to be doing a presentation as well after. Because of the limited time frame, I will confess that I mostly have slides, but there wouldn't be much of a demo anyway, so we'll talk about that later. So first of all, my name is Will Iverson. I'm the CTO for Dynacron Group. I've been doing software development professionally since '93, but '95. I've worked at Apple, Symantec, SolutionsIQ is the local one, and then I've had clients. Some of that period I had my own company, and then some of it was working for SolutionsIQ. Some of my clients included Sun, BEA, Canal Technologies, etc. I've written 4 books on software development: Hibernate, Real World Web Services, Mac OS X, Java Geeks, Mac Laptop, and Jakarta Commons, which no one bought, but it's a great book. And a couple of articles on things like site mesh and JNI and all that good stuff. So I've been kicking around for a little while. So I mentioned I'm the CTO for Dynacron Group. Dynacron Group is a consulting company that another friend of mine from SolutionsIQ and I formed in mid-2001. It's a technology consulting firm. We're about 15 consultants now. We're growing and we're hiring. So we're looking for both Java developers and also Java SDETs and also .NET developers. So if you or anybody fits that, please feel free to drop me an email, just williverson@dynacrongroup.com, or you can go to the website and check it out. Basically what we do that's a little different is, in addition to our people, which of course all of our people are smart and brilliant and all that good stuff, we also bring to the table a set of processes. Obviously you guys know SolutionsIQ, you've heard of them before for doing Agile. Dynacron Group practices what we preach on that. We do a lot of TDD, real strong emphasis on automation, and then we bring in tools. So a lot of stuff like continuous integration and also automating releases. So that's part of what we do so we put together teams that do all this and then deliver that for clients. Okay, so the agenda for the talk. So talk a little bit about that interface that everybody uses every day, pretty much, HTTP session. So what I'm going to do is walk through a little bit of a critique of that API and talk about what a few simple little interfaces mean for developing, deploying, and also how it breaks up or causes challenges with scalability. I'm going to talk a little about what some of the alternatives are and why you might want to do that, and then wrap up with some Q&A. So HTTP session. Okay, before I click to the next slide, why do you use HTTP session? Why do you use sessions? Anybody?
You use stateless.
You want to use state? Okay, what do you need state for? How does it mean?
So you don't have to database every single request.
So you don't have to database every single request. Okay, that's interesting. What else?
Authentication.
What's that?
You don't have to ask
Authentication.
the user to log in every single request.
Right. Okay, so those are the basics. What was the original classic one? It was shopping cart, right? Oh, you have to have a session to put your shopping cart. Okay. So part of the challenge about the session APIs is you start to walk through it, you realize that a lot of things that people used to use sessions for have actually kind of dropped by the wayside. Well, for example, shopping carts are no longer really transitory data, right? Your marketing department wants to know what people put into a shopping cart. I have things in my shopping cart on Amazon that have been there for like 2 years, right? So they remember that. So that's actually really does get persistent. What about the user interface? The reason I put this up here is there are a handful of frameworks out that throw a whole complex choreography of objects right into your session. And that's how they keep their component-driven framework live. So there are a few frameworks that do that, but most frameworks don't actually require that. Caching. So this is actually going to be the heart of what we're going to talk about, is the user session as a really, really lousy cache. Okay? Analytics. Some people want to do user sessions for tracking analytics. What did I click on as I'm walking through my site? This has some of the same challenges as shopping cart, and most of the people nowadays have stopped doing that. They're either using off-the-shelf analytics, or they rolled their own analytics, and that is a separate group, but uses the same mechanisms. User identity and login. In some cases, yeah, that's going to be a perfectly fine place, and you're talking usually about one string worth of a small chunk of data. But a lot of people nowadays are using single sign-on packages. For example, there's a package called SiteMinder. There's Spring Security, which does its own thing and hooks into your LDAP, what have you. So that's an independent thing. So basically, it's just cache data.
Isn't Spring and those others storing that stuff in the session?
Depends on the config. We'll talk about that.
One more thing, like JVM affinity, maybe.
JVM affinity. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. So, and that may be something that may not be part of HTTP session, but something else, right? So let's look at the interface. So I'm sure you've all memorized the Java docs around HTTP session. Or did you do like what most folks do, which is they just start using it? Hey, it's this cool little map. I can stuff things in and get things out. So for my request, I can get my session. What's the main thing that you do with the sessions is you have a key and a value. The key can be is a string. The value can be anything. It's just an object. So I'm gonna start shoving at&t objects in there, right? Whatever I want. Creation time, last access. Most people don't play around or even read those. Intervals you can set or get, which is interesting because technically that means that you might have a 15-minute timeout set for session expiration by default, but you can programmatically override that for certain users. The context to get config. Okay, cool. Name and ID. Okay, here's the brutal one. Number one, first the get set attribute. Okay, now notice that the value is an object, but it actually should be serializable. Why is that?
When Tomcat
Failover
shut
support?
down,
So failover support when Tomcat what? Dies, something to that
shut
effect?
down. It shuts
Shut
down,
down.
restart.
Yeah, so if the session's gonna hang around, which is part of why it's a cache, right? Because like you'd never put real application data in here, right? In your session. Huh. Okay. Now, before we finish, I'm going to point out there are two other interfaces that nobody uses but are on that session interface. The binding listener and the activation listener. This is totally fascinating to me, cracks me up. I'm going to stuff values in and then get callbacks when things change. Yeah?
When you stuff things in.
When you stuff things in and pull it out. Or whether or not the session is being passivated or activated, which cracks me up because passivated is not really a word. Okay. But this is not reliable because if your server dies, of course, it doesn't work, right? Okay, but you need these interfaces to build the app server. And that in there is also part of the hint of the problem, which we're coming up to. Okay, implementation. Everybody familiar with these? So you start using the session API, right? And you discover quickly that there are two things that are happening. By default, you're either going to be doing cookies, in which case you start having these JSession IDs pop up everywhere, which always, you can go to a million different websites and you'll see JSession ID cookies start popping up. And that tells you that the app server is using that cookie to store all the implementation stuff. The other way that you can do it, and of course this is how old the spec is that having cookies turned on literally was something that lots of people, their browsers didn't even support cookies. That's how old this spec is. So then they would say, oh, no problem, rewrite every link in your app to throw that session ID on. And some of the servers do rewriting for you, which can in turn cause all sorts of interesting issues. Like, what if I click and mail that link to a friend of mine? Type stuff, right? Okay. So here's my browser. I have a session ID. The session ID then points to a chunk of memory in here for my ID, the key, and the values. Here I have simple ones, and then here I could have a huge, complex, arbitrarily complex array of objects, or sets of objects, collections of objects. Now you'll note, this is interesting here, I have another one, and these can just stack forever, right? So in development, this is all awesome in development. I'm on my local machine, I'm doing dev with Tomcat, I'm clocking along, oh, I changed something, blew up, whatever, delete the contents of the work directory, I don't really know why it stopped working, and I move on. Awesome, right? What's wrong? Okay, well, then you go to deployment. So deployment's a little bit more complex. So this is the basic config I've seen now in many, many clients. I have an F5 load balancer. I'm calling them out by name, but there's products that fit in all these places that are replacements. But this is the common one. F5 load balancer to Apache to these Tomcat instances. And then I have my app deployed to those instances. Look familiar?
Very familiar.
Very familiar. Okay, so what happens? Browser hits the load balancer. Awesome. Okay, now I have to have sticky binding turned on in the load balancer to be able to do affinity. So that way the session goes to the right place.
Even
Okay.
to the JVM level?
What's that?
Even to the JVM or just to the Apache?
Yeah, to the Apache. Because
Okay.
see, I have two app servers fronted with one Apache, right?
Right.
Okay, now I want the
Sticky.
Apache, in turn, has to have some form of sticky binding to go to the right Tomcat instance. Okay? So you might say, okay, cool. Now I'm building up session state here. Okay, what happens if this Tomcat dies? Session goes toast, right? Right. So how do you solve that? You ignore it.
Ask the user to reload.
Or you do session replication via serialization. So remember how I said at the beginning earlier that the API should have been serializable, not object? If this is going to work, you have to make sure everything you put in your session is serializable. Okay? If it doesn't, and here's part of one of the things I find fascinating. You have, let's say you have a graph of objects that you're storing. Okay? What happens if half the objects are serializable and half of them aren't? Okay. So now let's play a game. Where could things go wrong with this? Anyone?
Anyway.
Okay. Everywhere. That thing's not set up right. Okay? I don't want to pick on IT guys or ops guys, but I have never in the last 10 years worked with an IT ops organization that got their load balancer set up right without extensive rounds and rounds of testing and configuration. It just doesn't happen. Apache, another magic set of configuration for the stickiness to work. If this doesn't work, or that doesn't work, then this whole scheme doesn't really work. Okay? Another one. We talked about how if you don't have your objects aren't being serialized and moving around properly, also doesn't work. Now, what happens as I add more of these?
100.
What's that?
If you have 100, you replicate 100.
If you have 100 of them, right?
Small
There's
stuff.
scale.
Chattering.
Chattering, right? They're all talking to each other a little bit. All right, let me drive this home. Now, remember, F5 is a big, expensive package that most people don't get a lot of hands-on practice with, right? The Apache modules that do this, those are a little bit more accessible because Apache's open source and people could come home and play with this stuff on the weekend if they felt like it, right? If, right? Then Tomcat here, this should be the easy part, right? Especially for a lot of developers. Okay, I'm not going to read this. This is the session replication configuration from the Tomcat documentation. You guys are all reading like, oh, crud. Okay, if your IT guys get any of this wrong, what happens?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing happens.
Nothing happens. If only it were true that nothing would happen.
Well, you get errors.
Not a hard fail, but something.
Nothing actually happens. I mean,
Well, no, you may get weird errors, right?
Transient.
Like transient errors. You may get the server works sometimes, didn't work other times. I get these weird format errors. Anybody ever see class format exceptions
oh yeah.
during development? It's because of this kind of stuff. It's you serialized out some stuff in your servlet from your servlets, and then when you went to bring the server back up again, they didn't match, right? I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. But your IT guys have to get all this set up perfectly. How many of you have done this in your development environment? Anyone?
Not all of it.
Not all of it, right?
Point number 5 is an
application point too.
Right. Which one is that?
The one about WebXML.
Oh, yeah. Right.
It's not even an IT guy.
Yeah. So is it no wonder that if none of this works on if you've never even tried it on your development environment, this is not in production?
Let me tell you, the errors you get with NTP issues are really weird.
Yeah, very strange exceptions. And because nobody, you don't have them set up in your environment, you can't recreate them. Okay. All right, so here we go. I've got my 4 Tomcats, I've got my app deployed, I think I've got my serialization working, awesome. Okay, we talked about what happens if the serialization isn't perfect, right? Like a portion of the, let's say it's the shopping cart, right? So a portion of the user's shopping cart has disappeared. Okay, that's kind of ugly. All right, what does it look like when I'm ready to roll out version 103? How does that work? Yeah, so what you do is you say, okay, well, okay, I'm going to redo the F5, redo the Apache, and have them not route to one of these instances. I tear down the instance, I drop in the new WAR, I bring the instance back up. Now remember the configuration that I had before, where I showed all the different things that you had to get right in the Tomcat, and then of course there's also the F5 and the Apache. The IT guys have to do all of that every time they do the deployment. And they have to do that each one of these, carefully bringing them up and down in a choreography. Okay?
That's up.
Right. And they would never, ever, ever screw that up.
Yeah. How many XML
Okay.
files is that?
Now, let's say that the shopping cart object format has changed. Okay? I've added an extra attribute or something. Or I removed one.
You
Or
gotta
I
use
changed-
some like serial version ID.
Right. So if I put serial version ID on, that just tells me that something's broken. Now, there is actually an interface for doing serialized object upgrade and downgrade. Anybody ever written one of those? Sweet. Okay. You guys should really give me a call about that.
You can't have it.
Exactly. Most people haven't done that, and it's because they don't want to deal with these kinds of issues because you have all these problems. Okay. So in a sense, like if you've ever done schema management with a database, this serialization stuff is just like that, only worse, right? Okay. So most people don't do it. And what happens is they say, well, I went to deploy the app blew up when I went to do it. I got all these weird class format exceptions, so I blew away the working directory and I blew away all the user sessions, and then I brought the servers up and everything was okay. That's usually what it looks like. And that's where people say, well, your apps are terrible because I have to have downtime.
We call that a rolling restart with cache cleaning.
Right, exactly. call it a name, but unless you do it perfectly, you have downtime. And remember, your IT ops guys are usually measured on uptime, so they're already bitter. Now, remember all that config where I had to matrix all these together with their config options so they know about each other? Well, let's say that your new scaling strategy is, we're going to use virtualization of cloud services. I want 10 more of these. Okay, you mentioned chatter. Dead, right? Just dead with that. In addition, you have that choreography times all those new machines. Okay, so let's walk through it. Now downtime, okay, well, if your serializations don't really throw now, not sure what happens if they don't. Scale, let's talk about memory. If I have a 1 hour timeout, 100 users, 100K session, 10 megabytes of memory. This is for nothing, right? Okay, 1 day timeout. I want the user, because remember, if I'm putting a shopping cart in there, I want people to come back an hour or two later and buy. 1,000 users, you threw a megabyte of data in there. Remember, all your character data is doubled right out of the gate because you're using UCS. 16, whatever, boom, you're up to a gigabyte. Okay, 1 day timeout, 10,000 users in a 2 meg session, 20 gig of data, you're never going to catch up, not even just on the serialization. Okay. All that has to be set perfectly. If I use the cloud, so have you guys checked out, obviously App Engine, right? You've heard of Google App Engine for hosting. There's also, Amazon has Elastic Beanstalk. Familiar with that? So Amazon Elastic Beanstalk is, they build out a load balancer and an app server and all this stuff for you and give you a Tomcat instance and you can just deploy a WAR. So you don't have to worry about setting up load balancers and all this stuff. But they cap you at about, I think, 4 instances. So the cool part is that if I'm a Java developer and I want to get app up and rolling, Elastic Beanstalk makes it cake to do all that stuff. But that's part of why they cap it at 4. Because they're assuming that you're using the Servlet API and they have set up all the sync stuff for you, which is cool, but even just the chatter can kill it. Lots of chatty nodes, you're still toast. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between a real cache and Servlet sessions. Okay. This is probably the biggest one. Servlet's implicit, real caching is explicit. So what do I mean by that? So most folks, they're using the Session API. And they're putting things in and getting things out. And most people never think, I'm actually dealing with a cache. I'm dealing with something that could go away. Poof, toast, gone. By making it explicit, by saying, for example, using an API or an interface that says cache, then you're telling people, by the way, this thing could go away. Because it's explicit, that means that you can tune it. What's the algorithm that is used by, or what happens with an app server when it starts to run out of session memory? What do most app servers do?
GC.
GC, that's assuming you can clean it out. But remember, you're hanging on to all those sessions.
Out of memory exception.
Out of memory. Boom. Maybe just start shooting things in the head, right? Real caches have an algorithm for how to deal with expirations. Okay? Cool. This is another one. If I built the app and I'm saying that it's relying on a cache, then that means the app should fall over gracefully if I take the cache away. If I'm using Servlet sessions, I have to have them to be able to run anything, and I'm coupled into the container. So we all talk about doing TDD, and we want to write nice, clean JUnit tests and not have to big fat integration tests where we have to shut down the server all the time. Well, if everything is tied into HTTP requests and sessions, then I'm still bringing up a container. Now, as a minor asterisk side note, there are some Spring MVC controllers that do mocking and give you a mock implementation, but still a lot of work to go through for that. So of course, if I do a real cache, I can do all that without firing up the web container. We mentioned configuration options, scaling. Last thing is most of the caches have their own set of debugging tools. So let's say that you get out of memory error. Your app server blew up. You filled up the user session space, and it went kaput all over. It's a technical term. What do you get? What do you get back? If you're lucky, you get back a heap dump, right? I did a presentation a couple months ago on heap dumps, right? So if you're lucky, you get a file that is the contents of the memory. And what you will get in there is everything in memory that was going on right then. That might include all of your details about your users. You get everything, and it's all munched together in with your code. So it can be very hard to figure out, well, did I just run out of space because I had too many users hitting it, or did my code actually do something that was more my code? If I use an explicit cache, then that is designed for and set up to deal with managing memory and caching. Everybody with me so far? Okay. All right. So now that I yeah.
I just want to pick a nit with one of your bullet points. That's detecting that you forgot to do serializable.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it simple to say restart Tomcat and it'll go and try to put it all down in the file system and bring it all back up, and you'll know which objects you forgot serialization on. I mean, it's not obscure. It's just do a restart and you'll see it. So I'm not sure that's like, oh, that's really important and whoops, you forgot.
Okay.
No, it'll happen.
So who does that? Show of hands. Who does that? Who
Testing
checks the
when
server?
we're gonna need to restart anyway when I'm testing. So why is that? It seems like if you don't stop and start, but occasionally
Right.
use the restart button, you will see which ones you haven't yet put serialization on.
Well, and part of the issue there is, in order for that to work, you have to be taking the app that you have that you're going to deploy, and the one that you're working on right now, and try the swap.
Oh,
out.
because of the serialization IDs and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that means that in order to test that, let's say that
you
I
said
deploy.
forgot serialization, but you're saying forgot to deal with upgrade serialization and such tricky things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, in theory, if you did everything perfectly, it would work fine. And if you built up all these processes around saying every developer, as part of their standard work, has a copy of the current app on their machine, and then before they go to do a release, they always take the copy of the current app, bring it up, load session data, shoot the app, then bring up the app, and then load in the old session data. So if everybody did that, and that was part of your standard work process,
Cross the version,
then yeah, you're fine,
Yeah.
right? I mean, technically, EJB 2.1 works. Did anyone here enjoy working with it? Right? It's all possible. It's I don't view software development as being how much pain I can endure. Okay.
What?
I know, crazy, but so which is a great segue into alternatives. So now that I've just beat my little drum here about how terrible this interface is and how it's the end of days and all that, let's talk about what the options are, because I don't want you guys to just walk out and be like, well, I can't use session APIs anymore and it's terrible. Okay, so what do we need? We need an interface. We need something to replace that. And then we need to talk about, well, what do the implementation details look like? Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
I have another comment.
Yeah.
So, if you can afford to use your sessions in an upgrade, of course, sticky sessions are a lot easier to deal with in practice.
If you can afford to do what?
To lose your sessions when you upgrade.
Lose your session when you upgrade.
Correct.
Right.
So if you have set with the business and all the users of the application that the application, whatever state is in the sessions, goes away on restarts, which is kind of my point about like treat it really as a true cache, then yeah, you're totally fine.
Yeah. And,
But-
then, and sticky sessions are easier to get right than all the session replication.
Yeah, but then if you're just doing sticky session, then you still have the problem, which is that you lose the node, right? I shoot
Right.
the server,
Yeah.
the session data goes
In
away,
that case, if you treat it like a cache, you can also afford that.
right? Which is kind of, we're saying the same thing, which is session data really is cache data for most of the time for most users. And all I'm really saying is that let's make it explicit. Don't make it something that kind of, oh, by the way, this is what's going on. Just be really clear with everybody about what's going on. So let's talk about the interface that you need to deal with session. Well, it turns out these are the core things that you actually really need. You need to get sessions. You need to set a value, get a value, and then if you're being nice, you should also have the option to flush it when a user logs out. And then if you're using your session stuff as implicit user validation, then you may need to have some kind of is valid method. Does that make sense, basically? Now, somebody mentioned single, like sign-on, right? That's a big part of this kind of stuff here, around the validation and the flushing, right? For what happens, how do I deal with the choreography for how I'm dealing with the user login? So a couple of little implementation notes. One thing, this small interface is independent of HTTP and HTTPS, which is really cool for testing it. It makes it really easy to reuse the interface across other things like your web services implementation. Why do I only put string values in? Okay, small serializable chunks. Strings are easy to serialize, easy to move, portable. And then if you want to make it really dumb and easy for web clients, you add a servlet filter. So then that way, there's a static method available for all your web developers to be able to get your state. And then just use it like it is for web services. So here's what that winds up looking like. I have a simple interface with a session. I maybe do an abstract class with a session ID and use a UUID. And I have a nice little servlet filter, which gives me static implementation methods here. If you're using Spring, you might be using that to auto-wire it in. And then you can drop in different implementations. You might use a database. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. You could use Memcache, or any one of those other caching implementations, which I'll talk about. And of course, for testing, there's my personal favorite, HashMap. Quick, dirty, fast. So if you use a HashMap, remember this is the interface I'm working with, so I can do this for testing. And now I'm going to be measuring test executions run in a fraction of a second. So I'm no longer having to boot a container to run my test suite. Okay. All right, so browser. So I'm sticking data on the browser. Generally speaking, unless I'm using some of the really advanced HTML5 stuff, the rule of thumb is like around 4K, about how much data you could store on there. It's insecure by default. You can hash data and throw it up in there if you want. I will note that HTTPS, if you're putting anything in a cookie, but and you're not using HTTPS, it's a security problem. So here's a little homework thing for you to do if you're fun or if you're sitting here with your laptop right now. Download and install this little tool. It's called Firesheet, and what it lets you do is it listens to your Wi-Fi network, and if it sees anybody hitting Facebook or Twitter, it picks them up, and then you can click one button and grab their session. So if you've ever been in a coffee shop and used Facebook, and someone had this utility, boom, they have your login. They're logged in as you
For that session.
for that session. But you can do a lot in a session.
You can change your username.
Right.
Since Facebook is all about and then doing things like posting.
Yeah. So you know.
Is that what happened to Wiener?
Exactly.
They should have just said that.
Yes, my son had installed Fire Sheet, taking pictures of it.
Well, it did start with I've been hacked, so.
Yeah. Anyway, so check out the tool. It's really creepy and terrifying, and you'll realize that you never, ever, ever want to put anything in a cookie, including even just that one little login string, right? Because at the most basic level, that's what you still always fall back to. Is you need a session cookie. You need a cookie, and it doesn't have to be a cookie set by your app server, right? You don't have to use JSession ID in the app. You could just put your own cookie on. But you need a cookie to track in the fact that the user is logged in. Once you've done that, as soon as they hit that login page where they're putting in credentials, everything after that better be on HTTPS, or you should just assume that you have users that are going to be walking away, grabbing those cookies on you. Terrifying, but true.
HTTPS isn't for computer.
No, but I still want people to be able to sleep at night. And I'm not a security guy, so I don't want to go that hardcore on it. That's actually another awesome presentation. David actually had a list of top 10 security issues from a WASP that I thought was really good. That could be a session later or something. Okay, so database. Everybody, I'm assuming most people here have used a database before. So one thing that's awesome about that is that it means people know how the heck to inspect it and debug it and figure out what's going on. Now, the first thing that people say is, what about performance? Is my database fast enough? Well, yes, it is. And because you're only using it as a cache, you're not using it as anything real, you can set it to just use memory. So I can set up MySQL to use as in memory cache. I could use NoSQL. A lot of people are talking about it nowadays. This is an excellent place to start playing with this. If you want to say, well, I'm going to start storing user session data in here, because it's all key value anyways. Right? Cool thing to start out with.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
If MySQL is to be used, wouldn't this have to be distributed and actually talk to each other? Like if there is no session affinity in this
Yes.
case, wouldn't MySQL instances have to be distributed and actually connected? So you when you go in and you redirect it to different server, your session is accessible from there between requests.
So yeah, that gets into the topology for how you set it up, right? So MySQL scales like a bandit, right? You can do all sorts of stuff. As you go on with it further and further, it gets more and more complex, just like anything, right? So if you are using MySQL as your caching mechanism, then you may wind up looking at things like distributed in-memory MySQL, right? Now, that may not be the end game that you want to go for. If you stick with the interface I threw up there, you can swap out implementations as you're going along and actually do performance testing without having to change any of your code. So is a distributed in-memory MySQL your best bet? Is Cassandra your best bet? Is whatever? I don't know. I mean, it depends on your app and all the stuff that you want to load it, which is awesome because it's like you teed me up for my next slide. So I grabbed a quick list. These are all the caching, just a small list of caches that are available for Java. Okay? All of these would be wonderful implementations to use. They all have very different performance characteristics. Some of them are designed for lots and lots of small data. Some of them are designed for very large amounts of data, like gigabytes of session data, if you wanted to cache. Some of them are set up for distribution. So you can have several different nodes and chatter if that's what you think you want to do. Some of them have different regions. So you might say, well, I want some caches to have this choreography and some caches to have that choreography. I don't know. If you've ever used Hibernate, then you've probably seen pluggable caches, and you've done some of that kind of tuning and stuff. Question?
So these are all distributed caches you're talking about, right? Because when you go to a different JVM or different server, you definitely want your data to be there.
Yeah. Well, that's where I was talking about the topology is going to vary. So these all will operate as, well, they won't all. I don't know about all because I haven't done an exhaustive analysis and comparison. That would be a whole separate thing. But most of these will operate as single JVM. Some of them will be in process, some of them will be out of process. So you'll have your apps running in one and then a second VM. So, and some of them have configs so that you can set up on the side. Some of them do distributed caches. Some of them have RDBMS backing stores that can attach to them, so then it can have a place to do overflow. Some of them are going to have memory. They'll have different algorithms, like keep things in memory that are frequently used, right? So for example, like let's say I have a scenario where I have users that, let's say I'm on a single sign-on, so I'm on a network where everybody's automatically authenticated, and I do header injection. So I'm not really worried about session expiration because it's taken care of for me. But I have some users that hit the site and they come, they do 1 or 2 operations, and then they're gone, right? And then I have other users that are living in my app. Well, these caches I can tune. So I could say, if people have hit this several times, then I want to keep that as most frequently used, and the people who come once in a while, their stuff can get flushed out of the cache. So I can still hold it all in memory. If that's distributed or if that's single instance or whatever, that's just part of the topology and the performance tracking API. My point is that you're now taking that performance and you're pulling it out of the guts of the app, and now you're making this something that you can just test separately. Very straightforward. Okay, a couple of arguments. Why use Servlet Sessions today? Hey, if it ain't working, it ain't broke, right? You have problems? Cool. But it is just a key value map, so hey, whatever. I will put this way out. If it works today and you're not growing, you're good, right? Server's running, life's good. Maybe that not growing part is something that you might have concern over, depending on your system and your site. But sure. But if you're growing, figure out what to do with it. This one, kind of actually horrible. If you just say, hey, it's IT's problem. They're the ones who have to deal with all the rolling restarts and all that crap. I just do development work and check it over to them. Well, that's not so good. That speaks to a lot of dysfunction. We'll just leave it at that. Except that they can't fix it. The IT guys won't be able to ever get away with solving it unless you help them. Part of the servlet spec, this would crack me up. We were brainstorming things. Hey, well, it's the servlet spec, so that's the way I'm supposed to do it. Okay, well, I didn't do EJB 2.1. I said it was stupid. I never had to quite deal with that pain. Now it's Oracle. They're running all these specs. You don't do everything the Oracle tells you to do, right? So why would you? Why you don't have any reason just because it's in the spec to use it? Okay. So a couple of benefits. Last little bit here. So having implemented this several times over the last 4 or 5 years now, some of the benefits have gotten. One of them, seamless deployments. Deployments have gone for the clients that I've worked with from being a big, oh my God, we're all going to die, all hands kind of affair to, oh yeah, we deployed. And this was critical because it meant all the sticky stuff went away, all the cluster stuff went away, and it meant that people could route traffic just by clicking a button in their F5. This was a huge one. We actually did this recently for a client. They were having a problem with their single sign-on package, which only occurred in prod, which is my favorite kind of problem. So the ops guys asked us to crank up the logging level just all the way to 11 for trying to diagnose what was going on. But we wanted to do that in prod, but we didn't want to screw everybody up. So what we did was we loaded up the app, changed the config, and we routed 10 minutes of traffic to this other server with the logging turned on. And then we routed everybody back. Nobody noticed because of having done this. I mentioned the ops relationship. The ops guys will, I don't want to generalize too much, but I'm going to say it. Ops guys pretty much will never tell you, I don't know how to set up the load balancer. They won't say that to you. They won't say, I don't know how to set up the clustering for Tomcat, right? Because they probably took a class on it, where they sat through 3 days of PowerPoints on how to do, not that there's anything wrong with PowerPoint, but they sat through 3 days of training on how to set all this stuff up, so of course now they know how to do it, right? So, but the reality is we saw how all the stuff that could go wrong. So the ops guys, generally speaking, will be a lot happier if this stuff goes away and they have to deal with it. And then I mentioned the seamless deployments. So because it was such a hairy thing, they used to do deployments at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was a dev on phone call, QA on phone call, and 2 ops guys on phone call, one who is more of a single sign-on guy, one who is the guy who's actually doing the deploys. As I'm sure you can imagine, everybody loved sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a phone pager or with their cell phone waiting to get the call for doing the deployment stuff, which, even if something went wrong, they would just say, well, you're just going to have to wipe the work directory and reboot. Okay. Further reading. I don't know if did I do a whole presentation on Play? I think it. Anyway, Play framework is my personal favorite Java development framework. It gives you the cool stuff of dynamic code, which is you can type and hit save, and the code, as soon as you alt-tab over to your browser, the app has been updated. But it's real Java code. It's not Groovy or Ruby or anything like that. Really killer framework. They have both encrypted cookie sessions data and the caching stuff all done, already implemented for you. So all that stuff I was showing you how you could do to implement, they already have that in there. Awesome little framework. Check it out. This is a post by the guy who did Play, and this was the inspiration for the talk in a lot of ways, which was explaining why the API is awful and some of the problems. As a side note, password hashing and stuff like that, I found this link to this nice library that does Blowfish password encryption. And then this is the clustering documentation that you can check out that I mentioned earlier. Last slide, 40 minutes in. Any Q&A?
For distributed cache, how does it handle the serialization of different versions?
Well, so all the distributed caches have the same core problem, which is that if I'm replicating data between them, they have to be serialized. Right? So remember how on my interface I just put string data in? That's to be able to have that happen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Although you still have to make sure you're not turning your Java objects into JSON and then saving that as a string and then having, because you're just serializing in a different form, right? And so you're back to the version problem. I've added new fields, new stuff, and if I don't make it properly backwards compatible.
JSON is a lot.
Oh no, I'm just saying you can't just drop it at saying I turned it into a string, therefore I'm totally safe, right? If you've got
Basically, he's doing
format
his
and
own
so
serialization.
forth in your strings,
Yes.
you still have to deal with that.
If I just did a serialized object and then did toString on the binary, that's not really the point. I bin hexed it and stuffed it in there. It worked. Here's the I'll throw this out as one little data point. We did a perf test on some serialization stuff at a previous client, and it was a bake-off between Java serialization performance and XML. And I was floored because they came out as a wash. And I believe it's because of all the class loader verification that the serialization stuff does, whereas the XML parser was like, hey, I'm bringing in text, I'm jamming it in fast. And there was so much R&D that people did around making the XML parsers fast. I wouldn't worry about it, you know. And if you do this, you start getting closer to being able to then, you know, break it out into separate nodes. Because remember, it's 2011, so more nodes, parallelization is king, not a big, huge box that I'm just jamming as hard as I can and I'm optimizing in the sleep, right? Different mindset. So, but the serialization stuff is much faster than I thought it was going to be.
Which XML parser?
Yeah.
If you will, the comparison you were talking about, which XML parser was like the fast?
I'm sorry, what was
Which
that?
XML parser did you compare? Or you were,
Oh, which XML parser?
yeah, there was like which serialization framework?
I don't recall. I think it was a Saks one because they were doing decent size. I want to say like 1 megabyte test object size. It wasn't like, you know, tiny little things with the DOM parser. It was decent size stuff. I couldn't tell you right off the top of my head which parser it was.
The whole parsers are pretty fast.
Yeah, the whole one's, I mean, yeah, it is well formed and not blowing up. You don't want to try and have some badly formed and then rely on a quirks mode type parser to guess, right? It's XML, solid. You're good. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on, I've heard of setups where you still use, basically you just avoid the HTTP session for caching and you read everything, write everything to your database using like Hibernate? Do you have any experience with scenarios like that and pros and cons?
Absolutely. Well, I wrote a book on Hibernate. A whole chapter on performance tuning and how you work with that. Hibernate builds in support for a huge number of these caches, the ones that I threw that list up. If what happens is then you can set up the caches, you do the interaction with the database, and then the cache holds onto the data in between. The complexity comes around your Hibernate mappings and getting all that configured and set up right, and then the tuning, because like, for example, when I'm working with Hibernate, and one of the best practices is to say, write some really tight HQL and just drag in what I need in one shot so I don't have to do all the round tripping. Well, weirdly enough, if you start flipping caches on, then you start wanting to have lots of little queries, because then those get cached, right? So you wind up having to do a lot of that kind of work. This is a side note. I've done a ton of stuff with Hibernate, and I'm at a little bit of a crossroads on Hibernate personally right now, because it is complex. And if you're willing to bring in folks who know Hibernate really well and can get it to work, it's awesome. But if you are just starting out or struggling, it's very easy to write bad Hibernate apps that generate billions of little queries, and then you have to go through translating it from Hibernate or HQL, because now it's JPA, so of course it's JPA-QL, but you need to do all this conceptual stuff to get to where you're going. And so the caching sits in the middle and it becomes a solution, but then you have to get really into the guts of knowing what's going on and what's happening. It's kind of brutal. So for a lot of folks nowadays, I'm leaning towards just use MyBetas, personally, and that might be a talk, a MyBetas talk, because they've redone MyBetas recently. It's all done with annotations. It's really slick now. So
iBetas, did you say?
Yes, this is
no, they changed the name. It used to be called iBetas, and then they switched over to
Just to
Google
confuse.
Code, and they renamed it MyBetas.
Okay.
Yeah,
I missed that one.
Because there weren't enough things that said "my" on them.
Yeah, or I, right? I mean, I or my at this point. I mean, it'd be a cool talk. I mean, if you guys want at some point.
Cool.
But anyway, I guess I'm up for time. So.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Will. I guess with that, David, you got the floor.
All right. I'm David Drake. I'm going to be talking about web testing with Selenium and JUnit. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you actually used Selenium before? Wow. Okay. Then the interesting part will be the back half of this, where I talk about how we're going to connect this into SauceLabs for virtualization of the testing. If you haven't done it, haven't used before, that's what I'm going to be demonstrating first. If I seem a little nervous, it's because the last time I presented I was 25. The average age of my audience was about 12 years old, and I was teaching math. There's a little PTSD in there. That was a little while ago. I don't have my own professional slide, especially after following up Will. It's kind of hard act to follow. I started testing when I was about a junior in high school. My dad came home and saw me playing video games and brought me in to look at ladder logic code, PLC2 to PLC5 conversion, line by line, and check to make sure that it was converted correctly through an automated process. It's pretty tedious stuff.
Your dad made you do this?
Yeah.
Exploitation begins at home.
Yes. He was accused of nepotism for that. Can you imagine?
Couldn't get anybody else to do it.
Yeah. Speaking of can't get anyone else to do it, that's how I started in Java, and my last job was that developers weren't testing their code, so I was brought in and started writing JUnit for their code. That's not the way you should do it. That's how but that's how I started to learn Java. What I'm doing today is working with Dynacron Group, testing web applications as an SDET, because of my experience from that, getting into intensive integration situations using lots of tricky integration points. Selenium, however, is much, much easier than a lot of that work. Selenium is dead simple to get started, so I'll get right on to discussing it. What is Selenium? It's basically it's a portable software testing framework for web applications. It has 4 basic components to it that basically takes you from a surface level where it's all just in a little plugin in the browser. Deeper, it's integrating into JUnit, and then even deeper still to trying to scale it out to run across grids to hit a bunch of different operating systems, computers across a network. Selenium IDE is just a Firefox plugin. It just lets you record tests and play them back. It stores them in a very tabular format. It's very easy for testers, even manual testers, to just get started. People who've never touched a line of code in their lives, because it's just so simple to look at. You'll see that in half a second. The Selenium client drivers are basically just a thin API that drives commands over to to a Selenium server, Selenium RC, so that you can move your tests out of that little tabular format into something that's a lot more maintainable, like JUnit, TestNG, or a dozen different languages. And Selenium Grid, I haven't used that personally, but that's basically how you tie that into testing across a test lab to sending out tests against a whole network of different test instances, test boxes. Rather than spend a lot of time explaining that, I'm going to start by going into why you would bother using it in the first place. Basically, the reason is because you want to test your web app, and it's one of the easiest ways to get started doing that. It's the same reasons why you would ever use any sort of automated testing, because it's going to be faster, it's going to be repeatable, unlike manual testing. You can be sure that every time it happens, it's going to happen the same way. Because of that, it's reliable. It's also cheap. Selenium is it's open source, and there's no cost associated with it, no licensing fees, as opposed to some of the bigger testing packages where you can click on this X point on the screen and that sort of thing, like Windrunner, I think. Some people will try to use that for web testing, but this is no cost associated with getting started on it. And it's also great for requalification. For any time you have a security patch come through, or you're wanting to test on a new browser that's just come out, Internet Explorer 9, Firefox 4.0. Running back through those tests manually is tedious, error-prone, but if you have it all in a test suite, then it's just a matter of changing a single string to send out your test instance, and it sends out your tests against a different browser. Yeah.
So there's a plugin available for the other browsers also, not just Firefox?
Well, I'll get into that in a little bit, but Firefox IDE is just a plugin for recording your tests in the first place. But there are web drivers essentially that can. Well, I'll get into it more in detail later. It's a slightly complicated question because it depends on whether you're talking about Selenium 1 or Selenium 2. In Selenium 1, the actual core that it sends out into the browser is JavaScript based, so it can be test against Safari, Firefox, Chrome, Internet Explorer. With Selenium 2, instead, they're using the WebDriver framework, which has basically a common interface over different drivers that go out to different browsers. But yes, you can test against more than just Firefox. Yeah.
You done anything with this with mobile testing?
Selenium 2, you can do mobile testing. I'll explain more about that when I talk about Selenium 2, but yeah, I'll let you anticipate. Last great thing about it is verisimilitude, because there's another way you can obviously test web applications is HTML unit, which loads faster, like 100 times faster, but HTML unit isn't going to actually try to render the application for you. And also, it's not going to detect all the problems that will happen when you try to run JavaScript on different versions of browsers. That's the biggest advantage we've seen in my testing, is that if you have an automated test, it's easy to run all your tests on Firefox and then run them on Internet Explorer. If you're in most of the places where I work, everyone does their development work on Firefox, and they never notice that there's a problem when Internet Explorer 7. And right. So, yes?
Just one last comment. The other one that comes up as a huge issue is when you deploy your app, the app then sits on this platform, and the platform needs to go through upgrades. The operating system, the application server, etc. And you can get this really dysfunctional relationship between the dev group and the ops group. So the ops group is trying to put out security patches and updates, but they don't coordinate with the dev group, so you don't know what broke. And so you want to be able to say, yeah, please put that security patch on, but let me run a requalification to make sure that the app still is okay. So you really need some of these web tests to be able to keep that train moving forward. Even if you're like, hey, well, we launched and we're done. There's still other stuff going on.
Absolutely. Right, looks like I have internet access, so I'm actually going to be able to do a real demonstration of recording a test. So I'm going to switch over to Firefox. Right. Get your real demo here. Now it just sits here as an add-on to Firefox, the Selenium IDE. I have a couple of tests already in here recorded that are unnamed. I'll start off a new test case. Just looking at this from a quick overview, it's going to store each command as I record them over here on the right, and it's just this tabular format. This button over here lets it know when I'm going to start recording, stop recording, and it's pretty much that simple. So I'm going to start recording. I'm going to set my base URL to bing.com. I wanted to use Google, but it has so much darn live content on the page that it's a little bit harder, a little bit trickier to actually record tests through there. But Bing is nice and old-fashioned, so it won't take long. So I'll just type in CJUG, hit search. Once I get to this new page, I'm going to select cjug.org. As you can see, I have a list of new options from the add-on. I'm going to assert that this text is present. So basically, all I'm doing is going to the page and making assertions. So I'm going to assert that this cjug.org is present. While I'm at it, I'll assert that the title is correct for this page. And click through. All right. Now switch back over to my test. And I see these commands recorded. I'm going to stop recording real quick and sort of run down what you see. First of all, it starts by, first command is opening the base URL, typing into this ID, the text value, clicking and waiting the go button, asserting the text is present, asserting the title, and clicking through that link. And as you can see, it's all very readable. Takes almost no time to record. And then I can replay it, just with this here, replay a single test case. And you see it bouncing through, replaying the test. All the lines are green, all my assertions are darker green, showing that the test passed. Now if I want to, I can, instead of just recording, I can manually insert new commands. Like on this page I could say, select from this long list of possible commands of all these different assertions, asserting selected IDs, getting content, moving content around, storing it, verifying it, waiting a certain amount of time.
So I have a question. It waits a certain amount of time, or does it wait for some kind of event from the browser?
It's hard it can't catch events from the browser, except for window loads. It's real good at detecting a new window load. But if you have to wait for an event from the browser, you'll need probably a custom bit of code, and I'm going to actually show you a piece of that code later. So running it through, so recording a test in the IDE is so simple that we take, like in my current position, we have a bunch of manual testers who've been doing manual testing all their lives. They can start recording these right away. There's very, very little ramp-up time for learning how to record these tests.
To answer your question, I think click and wait looks for a post back page reload.
Yeah, I think that'll set up the loop that I'm going to show. Yeah. Let's see. By the way, this is not a PowerPoint presentation. This is LibreOffice, so I have no idea if it's going to work at any given moment.
How's that different from PowerPoint?
I could show you, sadly. I could show you very quickly. Now, the real power of this is those locators on those lines. You see where it says click on this object and click, or go to this page, assert this text. The really powerful part of Selenium is just that it's able to find portions of the page, access them so quickly through so many different means. The fastest way is through the ID. If you have an ID tag on any HTML element. But you can also make assertions based on names and forms, by links, just by link equals, and then getting the text from the link. You can also do searches through the DOM. You can do searches for CSS classes. And last of all would be XPath, which is very, very incredibly slow and very brittle, so I hesitate to even mention it, but it does technically work. The trouble is that it tends to turn everything into big arrays of paragraphs and that sort of thing, which break as soon as anyone changes anything on the page. I'm going to show you real quick next how you get these into JUnit. The Selenium IDE is great for recording tests. It's terrible for storing them, in my experience. As you can see, it's kind of a flat list on the side there. You can organize these into suites. Hypothetically, you could build these suites out, test one suite at a time, just by selecting them in this window. I've never gotten it to work quite right. I don't advise you try. So the best way to export them is actually just to select whatever commands you're wanting to move into your Selenium test, and then you can change the clipboard format to any of these programming languages. For Selenium 1, you're going to want to use JUnit 4 remote control, JUnit 3 remote control, but you can also use Selenium 2 at this point with some of the later versions by using the WebDriver-backed JUnit 4 export format. So all you have to do is copy this text, see, then move into your test project. Let's open over here. Let's add a new test. And all the commands are converted into Java.
Nice.
You can actually export the entire thing, and it'll export it out into a test class. I can show you one of those over here. Basically the same set of steps that I did before, except that's probably really tiny. Let's see. That did not zoom.
It did, just not the way you want it.
There we go. Great. This is what it looks like. You can export the whole thing right out into a single class, but this has a few problems I'll talk about in a second. Yes?
So when you're doing like say you're looking for text when you're recording, does the IDE pick the best method to find it by? You're talking about the CSS, select all the different selectors. Does it figure out what an appropriate selector is, or do you have to figure out which selector you want to use at that point?
Yes and no. If it has an ID, if it has an identifier, an ID, it's going to use that first of all, which is great because it's fast and it's very reliable, because the dev is not likely to be changing IDs willy-nilly. Otherwise, it's going to fall back on XPath, which is terrible, it's slow and brittle. So what you record is not always what you want in your final test. It's more of a first pass, a rough draft, and you may have to finesse it later on. Especially because this is what you're recording is always going to work fine in Firefox. But what works in Firefox might not necessarily work in other browsers. Especially when you're trying to fire events on page, like on blur, for example. It works great in Firefox, doesn't work at all in Internet Explorer if you try to fire that event using Selenium. So what you end up having to do in that case is actually fire on blur, fire on change, or I think that's what they are. Both of them if you want to get the same behavior on both types of web browsers. So what you record is not always going to be your final version, but it's a good rough draft. What you get if you just export the test is it's going to actually extend Celanese test case, which is a huge problem because Celanese test case extends test case, which will fool a lot of your Maven runners or your IDE runners into thinking that you're using JUnit 3, in which case suddenly it's not picking up your annotations. We ran into this early in our project. It's a huge pain. So if you are going to just export these as test cases, just remove that. All you have to do is throw in a local variable for Selenium, and you're pretty much done with conversion. Except you'll also have to bring in an import for JUnit assert. That's about it. So I'll flip over and show you the project that I have set up here for actually testing these out. As you can see, taking a look here at my little Bing test that I had recorded before. All there is a for block where we create the Selenium instance. We tell it where our local Selenium server is, which browser we want to run against, and what our base URL is. All the actual logic for the test goes inside the test method, and then afterwards we just stop the server. Not a lot of setup, very little code for when you consider what this test is actually doing. The only changes to the POM that I have to make, I'm using Maven for this, is just adding a dependency for Selenium. The latest version is a test. I'm using these as integration tests because I also have mixed in here a few tests that are running against a local web app instead of running against a remote web app. As you can see, I have 2 pages over here have a sample of a test of those 2 pages. As you can see, it looks almost exactly the same. The only difference is that instead of hitting a remote server, I'm going against localhost. The setup for that, for the POM, is a little bit more complicated because we do have to set up a server and shut down the server afterwards. I use Cargo plugin, which is kind of a thin wrapper around any, it's a thin universal wrapper around any number of a wide variety of Java containers like Tomcat, Glassfish, Jetty. And I'll show you that in the POM. That doesn't have very much set up. There's just some boilerplate here, the deployable being thrown into Tomcat, and then we tie its executions to the pre-integration and post-integration phases. So it starts and stops the server automatically before and after I run my integration tests. And that's all you need in order to run your test against a locally deployed version instead of running it against remote.
Do you also use Selenium server to run?
You do, yes. And I'll show you that right now. I have this nice Bing test here, which is just like the one that I ran in the Sauce IDE. So if I try to run it just from Java, then I'm going to pretty quickly get a failure, because what this actually is a very thin API that is expecting to be able to communicate to a local Selenium RC server. The Selenium RC, going back over to the presentation real quick, so I can show you the nice slide that I have from Selenium. Basically, your test lid down here, it has this nice simple IDE that just has, Selenium do this, Selenium do that, Selenium did this, Selenium assert that. And what it's doing is sending these commands over to a local remote server, usually. It can be remote. And then that server is going to open up these different browsers and insert into them the Selenium core, which is, I believe it's based on JavaScript, with all the limitations that has. And that JavaScript is what's actually going to interact with the application under test inside the browsers. The Selenium server, it sounds more complicated than it is. All it is just a jar that you download, and I'll fire it up right now so that we can get the test working correctly. If I can remember which one of these, there we are. It has practically no setup, just have that running in the background, and then I can run my tests. However, this MacBook may be out of memory. Oh, that'll be just a second. But with the Selenium server, running, it just intercepts all those commands coming through to the localhost port 4444, and then passes those on to the different browsers that it opens up.
Pardon me, you said that it launches the browsers?
Yes.
And I didn't see anything in there that indicated which browsers to launch in your code.
Right. Right now that's set up here in this
Okay.
string when you first launch the Selenium instance. You get this special little string in here, star Firefox. It will tell it which browser to launch, and it will also give it some information about what kind of settings for the browser to launch. In that you can set it up in Firefox in proxy mode, where it'll inject a proxy server into the browser. Or you can set it up in a special security mode, which is confusingly enough called Chrome. If you actually want to run a Chrome browser, you need to use the string called Google Chrome instead. Let's see.
One of the tricks you can do is ignore all plugins and things like that, because that's particularly useful for Firefox. Because you get
Yeah, there are a lot
overhead
of
involved.
a lot of strange configurations that you can use for Firefox. It also starts with a clean profile, which can be a problem if you're trying to run tests for, say, through a secure connection. But I'll talk a little bit about that as some of the limitations of Selenium later on. All right, so the server started up. I can run this test. You'll see in the Selenium server, preparing Firefox, launching Firefox, It launches up there. That's the Selenium core. Firefox browser launches. Test is over. It's very fast. It's still, it's taking parts of a second instead of milliseconds. Over here in NetBeans, test is passed. All right, so now I'm going to talk about some of the challenges with Selenium. Now, this is what I just showed you. It's really easy to get set up, really easy to start running tests, but it's not without its own special problems based on largely with the design concerns of trying to run these things against browsers, especially because browser security models are constantly evolving to try to keep users from doing some of the kinds of things that Selenium tries to do. One is web app latency can cause tests to fail while waiting on page events. So if you have a live event somewhere on the page, you never know when it's going to be fired off. You don't have necessarily an event handler hookup for it. So how do you wait for those events to show up and keep your test from failing when it's working faster than the web page is processing it? Number two, tests tend to lock in the web pages. They slow iterative development. And as you can imagine, when manual testers first get started on it, they love it. They start throwing in tests for every single piece of text on the page, every page element, and then say your editorial team takes a look at the page and says, well, we just want to make these changes to the page. We want to remove a period here. We want to move this a few pixels over. So the tests are breaking. Testers are complaining to the editorial team, saying that they're changing things too fast. They're spending a lot of cycles having to update their tests. How do you handle it? Third one is that's the Selenium core. That core that gets injected into the browser and actually delivers the browser commands from Selenium RC is JavaScript based, which means that not all browsers are going to interpret it the same way, the commands that get passed through. You can't perform cross-domain testing unless you have some very, very tricky setup because of the single origin policy for JavaScript. And testing secure connections is tricky, and often it's very browser specific, which is no good because you want to be able to take the same test and you want to run it against any browser you want without spending a lot of time on setup. Execution of these is slow, especially because, like I said, testers, once they get it, they start running as many tests as they can to show what great work they're doing. I say this from experience as a tester. And so pretty soon, this test only takes a few seconds for one of those methods. But now you have, like say, 20 methods for a single page. You have 5 pages. You're bouncing up to 100 methods. You add in scenario tests. And suddenly your tests are taking an hour, 3 hours. I think one of our teams, after working on development on one of the applications for about a couple of months, their tests had run from end to end 3 hours. And that's with testing 4 browsers all at the same time. Last of all, the formatting problems for the pages are going to are untested. It looks like it's going to catch all the formatting problems because it's going to render the page, it's going to show it, but no one's necessarily looking at those pages. So it's not going to notice that, say, this button is right on top of this button, or this text is incredibly small and invisible, or something like that. It looks like it should catch that, but actually trying to catch those with Selenium is darn near impossible, especially because all the browsers display CSS classes in different ways. Just trying to find out if a piece of text is bold in Firefox and IE, totally different. It might throw out numbers, it might show out letters, etc. Yes?
Are you going to go into solutions for some of these?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
I will hold off the question.
Yes. So starting at the top with how do you handle event latency. In other words, something happened on the page, we don't know when it's going to happen, and what Selenium will do if you use the click and wait function, it'll throw in a little piece of code that looks kind of like this, and all it is a very simple loop where it checks to see if an element is present. If the element is not there, it's going to throw an exception, catch the exception, increment, try again a second later. That's the way we typically had to handle latency. The real trick, though, is that it's hard to tell sometimes when you need to use a method like this where you're trapping that error, or when you can just use a wait for page to load, where you just pass in, say, a string parameter telling it how many milliseconds to wait for a page to load. And that's just trial and error with testers learning, when is a new page going to load and when is this going to be a live event that's actually on the page. Yes?
Also, Ajax stuff will only work with this method.
Yes, absolutely. If you have a lot of Ajax in your page, you'll end up needing to basically take this method, and like I say, make it static, use it throughout your tests. Next, how do you handle change for an application? particularly like in an agile environment where you're getting you're wanting to test as early as possible, so you're getting early cuts of these pages. The best way to handle it is to separate out all of the content from the actual test. Separate out anything that might possibly change, like any of your field locators, any of your page titles. We basically took them and added them to a class full of constants, so that anytime I need to refer to, say, the password field, all I do is refer to the password field constant. So I don't care if my strategy for locating it changes, if I'm referring to it using CSS or using an ID, because if the development team decides to change it, I only need to change it in one place instead of changing it in 100 tests. So that's just my advice on that. Separate out any of that page content from your actual tests. Next, the problems with addressing that third point there, Selenium core is JavaScript based. One solution to that is going ahead and bumping up to Selenium 2, which is the next generation of Selenium. We don't use it yet because it's not released yet. You'll notice on the disadvantage side, there's no final version yet. It's got release candidate 2. It's in a pretty mature state, but it's supposed to be coming this summer. The advantage, Selenium 2 uses the WebDriver interface, which is a big change. It doesn't use a Selenium server. It instead has custom code that's going to talk to the browser APIs directly, which means that it has custom code for Firefox, for Internet Explorer, for Chrome. That lets it talk to the browsers in a much more idiosyncratic way, in a much more reliable way as well. Because of that, you don't need a Selenium server to inject the Selenium core out. Because of that, you can actually do cross-domain testing because you're not having to worry about JavaScript, single origin policy. It also has a slightly different API with some backwards compatibility, which is much more object-oriented. You can get elements on the page instead of always going Selenium dot get this thing, get this locator and do something. You can actually grab elements, make assertions on them, click them, etc. It's much more familiar for a Java user. And it also permits mobile browser testing. Now, the way that I understand that it works, and I haven't tried it myself, is that you have to install a server on the mobile device, and then that server will intercept commands and pass it through to the device's browser. But that's at least a solution for mobile browser testing. The disadvantages of it are, first of all, it hasn't really been released yet. If you're starting a new project today, I might start fooling around with it, but 3 months ago, wouldn't. It has limited backwards compatibility. You can port tests over into it, and I'll show you exactly what the differences look like right here. Because I have an example of the export from that Selenium IDE. No longer open. Here is our Selenium 2 Bing test. The difference is really just in that setup piece. In that instead of starting up a Selenium instance, you're actually setting up a WebDriver instance, and then you create a Selenium instance from the WebDriver. This has limited backwards compatibility because you don't have a JavaScript Selenium core inside the browser. So some people use commands that actually go to that Selenium core and deliver commands like saying this.browserbot do this. Those will no longer work with Selenium 2. But otherwise, as you can see, the core of the test is unchanged. So that's one solution to some of those problems with having a JavaScript-based Selenium core being injected into all your browsers and getting away from using that. And next, one of the biggest problems is how do you speed this up? Because spending 3 hours waiting for a test to get done, and you just imagine, you can see what that does to a testing department. When you're like, I'm going to fire off the test, I'm going to go get a coffee, maybe I'll come back in a couple hours, see what happens. Yes. There are lots of ways to optimize this. First of all, never use XPath. XPath will always, Selenium IDE will always propose a way to find the element, and that way may be XPath. Never use it. As a tester, what we do every single time we see that, if we can't locate it reliably, we would file it as a bug and tell the developers they need to add an ID to it. Anything we need to test, we need to have an ID on. It's just It's not that hard to put it in the HTML. If you can't have an IDE because it's like some dynamically generated text, for example, then use another locator method like CSS. Another way to speed this up is to reuse browser sessions. You notice in the test that I have, the test that I have exported, in the before method, we're starting a new Selenium instance every time, and in the after method, we're stopping it. This obviously has tremendous overhead. If you have 10 different tests in this class every single time, you're starting up a new browser and shutting down that browser. Depending on the speed of your machine, you can imagine that's a significant overhead over time. One way you can work around that is by reusing that browser session and just closing all the windows in your after block. This has a slight disadvantage in that if your browser session goes really wonky, every test method after that will fail. If you crash the browser with your test, everything after that's going to crash too. But if it's that bad, that's probably something you're going to investigate really quickly.
We found that the single most often reason why our CI gets hung up every month is when Windows updates come in, and that somehow hangs up Selenium's IE startup shutdown mechanism. Have you found a solution for that, or have you run into that? Or?
We have a different way of managing. We don't handle the Windows updates because we send our test out to the cloud to virtualize instances. I'm going to hit that at the end of this.
SauceLabs?
Yeah.
Okay.
SauceLabs, yes.
Speaking of Windows, have you been able to get IE working on Linux to test with Selenium?
IE working on Linux to test with Selenium? No.
You can install through Wine IE running to work with Selenium.
Gosh, that is not on our list of supported browser OS combinations. Bouncing back to that list. Oops. Another way you speed things up: avoid multi-page test flows. Like you don't want to you don't want to be diving 5 pages in through a Selenium test for 10 tests in a test suite. If possible, what you want to do is find a way to shortcut those. By finding a way to inject that session data so that it looks like you're in a later state, rather than going through that flow every single time. You can also, another way to speed it up is if you're testing multiple browser types, is to use parameterized tests to inject those different OS browser combinations and test them in parallel. That's one of the first optimizations that we had, so we were running 4 to 6 browser combinations at once in different threads. You can also parallelize your tests using the parallelized test case test runner to run multiple test classes at once. Trying that with basically those two in combination, trying that on our 3-hour test suite, cut it down to about 30 minutes, using the same processor, same memory, same resources. The only problem with parallelizing your tests using this way is that if you have, say, some Spring resources that you're wanting to bring in, you need to have them auto-wired, and you can't use the parallelized test runner and the, say, Spring for JUnit test runner at the same time. You'll have to find a different solution for bringing in your auto-wired dependencies. And last of all, you can use cloud-based testing services for offloading the load from your local machine for all these browsers. And the solution that we've been using is SauceLabs, which is the next sort of point here.
Before we move on, one question about
Yeah,
previous item.
sure.
Can you talk more about avoid using multi-page test flows, specifically with an eye towards getting your test data set up over and over again for tests and still having them isolated? How are you doing that?
Well, what SauceLabs recommends...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
What's that?
Repeat the question.
Absolutely. Sorry. He's saying, how do you do this? How do you avoid using multiple page flow? How do you inject that data so you can reach later pages of your page flow? That's kind of specific to your implementation. If you're using sessions, for example, then you can be injecting that data into the session table. If you're, like in my instance, we had a page flow where you would register someone, and then later on you would verify the user. Instead of registering them by using the entire page flow, we registered them by injecting the registration information into the database instead, and into the LDAP. It requires a little bit more integration work, so you need to have, say, an SDAT to help speed that up. But it's going to shave off, seconds off of each test, and that adds up very quickly. So that's my advice on that.
Yeah, we do the same thing.
Okay.
But we insert the data through the service interface rather than directly in the database, so it's more maintainable.
Okay.
But I wonder how that would work with SauceLabs, and maybe you can get into that when you talk about SauceLabs.
That's what they suggest is with session IDs. So SauceLabs is basically a service that sells minutes on virtual machines. In essence, what they have is and I'll show you the list of browser OS combinations that they support. Now, obviously, if you're wanting to do this web testing, you're wanting to test against, all of the different OS browser combinations that your users might be using. Now that you have all these nice suites of automated tests, you want to test them against IE, IE7, IE8, IE9, Firefox 3.6, Firefox 4, all of these different, and on different OS browser combinations. If you're trying to do this in-house, then you're talking about maintaining a testing lab with all these different combinations, worrying about different patches, Windows updates. Every time a new browser comes out, you have to build it up again. Have to worry about machines going down. Giant headache. And SauceLabs handles that. And I'll show you the list of, here are the OS browser combinations they have in SauceScout. You can actually just do manual testing, log on to a machine, it'll fire up one of these browsers for you, and you can start testing your application under test. They also have all these browser OS combinations available for testing through Selenium. Yes?
Does that assume that your application is accessible from their site?
I will talk to that.
Okay.
Absolutely. And this includes, all of the releases over the last, N years, 5 years or so. Internet Explorer, Firefox, Opera, Safari, Chrome, and they have test instances on Windows 2003, Windows 2008, and some Linux as well. Now, the services they provide with this, basically the way that you can access this is, first of all, through SauceScout, which lets you do manual testing using any of those OS browser combinations. It'll just open up the browser for you. You can start clicking around through it. There's a lot of latency to it, but it's a lot easier than trying to set that up on your own machine. There's also Sauce on Demand, which is the automated cloud-based testing, but it's sort of a replacement for Selenium RC. I'll show you the code for that in a second. But basically, it's just, all it is just instead of pointing towards a Selenium RC server, you're pointing towards their remote cloud-based servers instead. And they handle all the balancing and redirection for you. They also provide Sauce Connect, which is a tunneling utility for connecting to an application under test behind a firewall that handles all the forwarding between ports, forwarding between different hosts. It's a little bit fussy to connect, but basically under the covers it's just plink. And using SauceScout, you can set up your tunnel, use SauceScout to try to look at your application, and you can pretty easily diagnose whether or not you can actually see the application behind the firewall. And last of all, there's Sauce Builder, which is kind of a Selenium IDE modified to run test on Sauce on Demand. I don't like Sauce Builder as much. I think it tries to do a little bit too much for you. I prefer the Selenium IDE, but it can help if you have manual testers that are used to using Selenium IDE and they want to start using those same tests against SauceLabs. That's the replacement that helps them do that.
Is it better at managing test suites than the plain Selenium IDE?
I'm not sure. It can't be worse. Here's the basic structure of that. Basically, your test, instead of hitting a Selenium RC server over here on your local machine and hitting the web server, it's going out through the firewall to a remote Selenium RC instance, setting up the browsers, then running through an SSH tunnel endpoint if you're using Sauce Connect back over to your web server. And it also has a REST API where you can kind of do some inspection on that to get session IDs and that sort of thing, and to provide metadata for your tests. And I'll do a quick demonstration of that. Luckily, we have a network connection here. And I'll show you a piece of code. And basically, it's the same Bing test that we had before. And the only difference is the Selenium instance has a lot more data pushed into that, pushed into the Selenium RC server. The server location, instead of being at localhost, is on demand, SauceLabs.com. You can try this out yourself. They give you 200 free minutes a month if you sign up. The only difference is that you can only test one OS browser combination, so it gives you a feel for it without being able to really use a lot of the bigger features. But you're passing through just some JSON configuration information that tells it, who do I need to build for this test? What OS are we testing against? What browser? What version? What's the name of this test? So you can find it later. And what your default URL is, just like you would pass into the old Selenium RC instance. Other than that, the test is exactly the same. The only difference is that I've slowed this test down by setting the speed to 250 so I can get a good video of it. I will go ahead and try to run it now. Depending upon what our network looks like, it may not work, but because there's a little bit more latency built into these tests because it's going out to SauceLabs. I'm going to jump back over to SauceLabs and try to catch this test in the process. So on demand, view my tests. Okay, here it has a list of all the tests that I've been running over the past few days getting ready for this. And it looks like it's saying that I have one in progress here. I click on the test and it will give me, hopefully, a real-time video showing the test. Here it is running through the exact same test, hitting CJUG, closing out, test finished already.
Is that a job output to display the project?
I'm not sure what it is. I think it's Flash, actually, because when I download it, it's always Flash videos. The test is done, and I get all of this nice information, and this is all stored on their servers for 30 days. You can send through additional information with it, including like what build you were testing, some tags. The tags that we typically use are, what tester was actually running this test, so you can search based on your username to find which test you were running. Since across our organization we have a bunch of could have a dozen testers at one time running these tests. You can actually pass fail information using the REST API. And you can download either a video of the test or the raw log. Here's the commands that I actually sent over. You'll see all those commands from the Selenium test is being replicated here, and the log also is kind of to tell you how long each one of those commands took. It was really easy for us early on in our testing process to tell, gosh, XPath test commands are taking 10 times as long as CSS commands, for example. And also on the left here, you'll see that we have screenshots at most of the critical points in this test. Like over here, where I'm waiting for the page to load, it's showing me that list of search results. And of course, you can also look at the video. Which will probably take a few seconds to load. You'll see this, the same Selenium core starting up. There it's searching for CJUG, checking the text on the page, going to the CJUG page. Done. Yeah.
The question I had to do with snapshots. If you weren't using a tool, if you weren't using SauceLab, and you wanted to incorporate some kind of mechanism to take a snapshot of the screen as it was, we're using Selenium 2, so we're using WebDriver. Do you know of some feature or a tool that you can incorporate to take a snapshot on error?
Not off the top of my head. Anyone else know of a tool like that?
What was it? You want a tool to run it?
On it, whenever we have an error in our test, to have it take a snapshot of the state of the page.
You mean a screenshot?
Screenshot, yeah.
I think you can.
You could do it coding wise because there is a Selenium save snapshot command.
Oh, there is? Okay.
There is, but you'll only get the view that's currently in the open view. You don't
Yeah,
get
that-
the whole page, which is kind of what you want.
Well, that'd be fine because it usually moves it around and everything.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what we do with this thing, what's cool is you don't have to worry about that. You just, if there's an assert,
Right.
we print out in the error message the URL for the job. So then you just click and boom, you're right there and you see the screenshot.
Yeah, that's been, usually you'd have this whole suite of tools you'd have to do to get a lot of this information. But all of this is stored for us, and whether or not we need to use it, whether or not we want it, and it's up there for 30 days. The videos you download are also really clean, but they're Flash videos, so you have to have special players to view them, convert them, that sort of thing. That's the only real pain with them. They're so high quality, they just tend to be too darn big. And that's the final state of the browser there. All right.
So did you say you were capturing the screenshot by recording the URL and then jumping to the? Is that what you? What was your solution there? SauceLabs. You jumped to the page in SauceLabs that had that screenshot. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So, as the output of the output for each test, it puts the job that's running, and then it has the link that the job's running on. So then in that console output, you just get a link to a test that failed. You click on the link, boom.
And SauceLabs has captured it.
So we've got all the screenshots and the whole flow and the video, blah, blah, blah. There you go. Watch the demo.
And yeah, and it also, SauceLabs now also supports Selenium 2 as well. So you can send through WebDriver-based tests.
Pretend WebDriver that goes over.
Yeah. And that's pretty much it for the demonstration of SauceLabs. So here's some new resources, just some links back to links back to the pages that I'm using, Cargo for the thin wrapper, SauceLabs, and Selenium HQ for the documentation there. And then this on the blog is posted this presentation as well. So we got about 7 minutes left. So if you have any questions about this, happy to answer. Yeah.
So we are using Selenium 2. Whoops. But we've been using it since January. Our biggest problem with it is it's somewhat brittle sometimes as far as running some of the tests, but I think we got past most of it. But the question I have is we don't use any recording mechanism to actually write our tests. We seem to do it the hard way, which is basically writing the tests in Java and figuring out what the selectors need to be to look up stuff and so forth. Could we, I mean, I really haven't played around with the IDE to know, could we just record tests or use that as a benefit for the starting point and then switch over it?
Absolutely. It's really easy because I end up writing the test in the same way after a certain point. Because I'm mostly, if I'm testing a field on a page, I'm going to be testing different combinations of characters in it, blah, blah, blah. So I'll just be cutting and pasting code across the page. And then if I reach a point where I'm like, well, I'm not really sure what I want to record at this point, then I can just jump over to the Selenium IDE. I can show you that right here. Set it to record, go back over to my page. Say I want to figure out how I'm going to locate this element here. I'm going to say assert text, and there's this nice ugly piece of XPath, but just for the sake of demonstration, click on that. Jump back over to here, stop recording, and then I can take this assertion, copy it, and drop that right into Java.
Which is way faster than perhaps using Firebug to figure out what the XPath would be, or
sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's not.
Yeah. No, it's
but
faster.
It's another option.
Did you talk about the parallelization stuff we did?
I haven't talked about it much because it's kind of but yeah, one of the things we did was for our tests, we have a parallelized test runner so that instead of running, say, one OS browser combination at a time, we actually run them using a parallelized test runner. I don't have an example over here because it's a little bit more involved, but the parallelized test runner just basically has a parameterized method that feeds in the different OS browser combinations. And because of that, what the advantage that gives us is instead of running one at a time, we can run all of our OS browser combinations at the same time. The disadvantage to that is that whatever your test class is going to run as slow as the slowest browser in that pack. So it's going to run as slow as IE7 every time. But the advantage of that is that you never have to worry about switching over between browsers. It's tested automatically every single time. On top of that, we also have threading so that we're running more than one class at a time. So we'll say, for us, we just have in the POM, we just have a single property, like, or we set to say, usually for our test boxes, it's around 8, which is how many threads we want to start at a time, and that'll start 8 test classes running, which will then spawn 4 different instances for each one of the browser OS combinations we're testing. So we'll have 32 threads at once. And then all of those can be fired off at SauceLabs. It accepts them gratefully, loves the minutes, and runs our test for us.
The cool part about that is that got like a 3-hour test suite down, or more actually, down to like less than 15, in the 15-20 minute range. So by parallelizing out, boom.
And it almost never passes. Boy, that's somebody too. No.
Well, that's part of it. Because the thing is we don't want to do is be in that pattern where, and I've had this conversation with managers, which drives me bonkers, which is they say, oh, well, the test suite's taking 4 hours to run now, so let's not do that often because it takes forever to run. And you're saying, well, actually, that's so much faster than a manual regression. But if you don't understand what's going on, you say, oh, well, I don't want to wait for the test suite to run. So it's really important to always be pushing ahead of that curve so that the test suite doesn't become a burden, but instead becomes an aid. And so that's why, we forced out concurrency issues in the app by doing this. It became like almost a little load test, right? It's like 40, 50 concurrent runs, but it's great, and then the managers all love it because they don't have everybody complaining about how long the test suite takes to run.
So are you doing this in a CI mode?
Yeah.
So how do you launch to SauceLabs from your CI builder?
Well, so remember, all this is really, so every time it says Selenium dot something, in your head what you should think is that's a service request going over the network to something. And the configuration of what's going to is the thing above. That's just JUnit, right? So the CI environment is just Maven, kicks off the builds, goes out, and it goes out over the network. Now, I think you talked a little about the tunnel.
Right.
So the tunnel, the SSH tunnel, lets you access resources internally from SOS because it sets up a port forwarding tunnel, comes back in, and then hits something out on your network. So it does mean that, like, for example, you have to be in an organization that's okay with establishing an SSH tunnel to a service. If that's not okay, if you're in an environment like that, then you're back to having to set up something like Selenium Grid internally, right? Because at that point you're like, okay, well, I'm dead. That said, PCI compliant companies, PHI issue companies, they've been okay with this because it's test only. So there's no data going out, right?
Do you get all those great, output that you get from SauceLabs? Do you get that through the grid? Or is that, you forget that, that's only available through SauceLabs?
Yeah, you have to build that. Some of it you can get, like for example, if you want to do the screenshotting thing, you can do that. I'll just say, like, some of this stuff gets really complex, and if you wanted to set up time to talk about it later, feel free to reach out to me, and I can walk you through it, because it gets really hairy and it deals with particulars of your environment, particulars of what you're trying to do, all that kind of stuff. So.
At one point, we were, we still are using like GWT, in like a combination of GWT and some other framework and a heavy AJAX side. Like writing Selenium test was painful to begin with, and then they pretty much immediately would break the next time someone changed one thing on the page because of the way GWT renders JavaScript and all that. And so, has that brittleness changed with Selenium 2, or are there techniques that work well for that, or later versions of GWT? I mean, because we kind of stopped playing with it at that point, right?
You can set IDs on GWT. If you just use the AutoGen one, then you're going to get all these weird hash IDs. But just set your IDs, and you should be okay. That's my superficial quick answer.
Earlier you mentioned the one where you were waiting for visibility of an element, and yet Will mentioned the fact that each one of these Selenium calls is effectively a network call, especially to SauceLabs. Does Selenium come with a wait for visibility, so you don't have to loop and call and make network requests for that?
Yeah, so does Selenium too. The WebDriver has those types of mechanisms as well. They will wait, and you can set the wait time.
No, I'm not talking about wait file. I'm saying wait for visibility. So I want to give an ID.
Yes, you can do that.
Okay, and I don't have to loop personally. They'll do the looping. Okay, and regular Selenium does it, or just Selenium 2?
Well, I can speak for Selenium too. It does. So
regular Selenium too.
Also.
Regular Selenium also.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, at SauceLabs, since it has to go through the internet, you have the Space Shuttle and it does all this recording, does it put a lot more time on the test? How much does it increase the test time?
It increases the test time. I'd say it makes it, the test time will be double, maybe triple, because of the fact that you've got all this network latency built into it. Your browsers are going to start off a little bit slower because you're actually starting up the VM in a lot of cases. But on the other hand, if I'm running this on my machine, that's what my machine is doing. It's going to be firing up all these browsers, it's going to be popping up all over my screen. There's nothing else I can do. If I'm sending them out over to SauceLabs, I don't have any clutter, so it's keeping me clear. It's got a lot less load on my machine. So it may take longer, but the effect is a lot less on me as a tester.
Your machine is still driving it, literally.
It is, but the load on my machine, because it's not firing up the browsers, is significantly less. Unless I'm running in a continuous integration environment, in which case, I'm just firing it up there and waiting for results. Yeah.
Are these JUnit or TestNG tests runnable standalone as the way you have them built here? Or
Absolutely. I can run them standalone, especially if I'm running against a remote server. If I'm not running against my local machine, I can just fire it up. I just need to make sure that I have a RC server running, unless I'm using Selenium 2, in which case it's just going to go straight into the browser. If I'm running against...
What are you tweaking, or what double configuration, or default parameters, or what are you doing to make it so they're automatically run locally by the developer, but you go into the integrated test when they're all run together?
The only thing that I would do is that on the command line, I'd probably stand up the server using Maven cargo start, and then I'd run my tests.
So the nowhere in the framework does it say start the Selenium server, right? Okay.
Right. Although you can get Selenium server plugins for NetBeans. I've used those. I've used that, and there may be some plugins for other IDs.
Well, that's just to have it running on the side separately. Turn it on, then try your test.
Yeah, but then it'll fire up automatically if it's looking for it. There tends to just fire up as soon as the IDE starts up.
So the top of this test says I'm going to server localhost or whatever?
Yeah, right.
So that's not configurable the way that's done right there, but you must do that.
Totally configurable.
What's that?
Sure, it's configurable.
Well, I mean, that's not. That's hardwired.
Oh yeah, this is hardwired because this is just me dropping in tests, as fast as I could. But I mean, definitely it's configurable. I mean, I could pass these in through the POM, for example, or system properties, any number of ways.
What actual method do you use to pick the host? So
in my actual test environment, we run these sometimes locally on our machines, and sometimes we run them up on TeamCity engines, for example. So what it's actually going to look for is the host name. If it has a TeamCity host name, if it has a TeamCity agent name, then it's going to use that configuration. If it's running locally on my host, then it's going to use a slightly different configuration. The big difference there is going to be the way that the tunnels are handled, going out to SauceLabs, because with it has to inject the correct host name into that tunnel so that it redirects the test back to the correct test machine. If I want to run these same tests, for example, against QA environment or a dev environment, is the same ones that I'm running locally. Generally, that's not the case. Generally, I want to run a different kind of test against QA than I want to run against a local build. But you can just handle that with a different profile.
So that the before goes, what environment do I really want here?
Well, I'd have it set up like on a web test constants page, and that would actually tell me which what my current test server is, for example. And then I'd use a Git system property there with a default to localhost.
So you're saying it's all in the Maven config, right?
I love to have it all in Maven config, personally. Because I want to be able to just kick it off on the command line with one option and get it to the right place I want to go. That doesn't have to be the way it is, but that works for me.
So you're not supporting the developer right-clicking on a test and saying, I just want to run this one because I know that's exercising what I just changed.
Well, that depends a lot on the IDE, what options you're able to pass.
You know, he calls you up and says, which one of these is really good ones for what I'm doing here? And you point him at 3 of them, he's going to run those. And he didn't build them, you built them. They're really great. They're hardcore tests. So he wants to know which one to run. But he doesn't want to run the whole suite, he wants to run those.
All right, well, folks, if you guys have more questions for David or Will, we can hang around for a few minutes. Gonna meet for beers at the Virginia Inn. Other than that, thanks, David and Will from Dynacron.